In this today's session of pharmacology and physiology, we'll talk about the treatment for the peptic ulcer. So here, before we'll talk about the drugs used for peptic ulcer, we should know how the gastric acid is produced in our body. So then only we can understand how the drugs inhibit the gastric acid in the stomach. Okay. So for this, first we need to know what is peptic ulcer and what are the causes for peptic ulcer and how the gastric acid is produced within the stomach and what are the triggers, and then we'll discuss the approaches for the peptic ulcer treatment. So here, what is peptic ulcer? Peptic ulcer is nothing but any break or any breach or any erosion within the gastric mucosal lining is considered as the peptic ulcer. So how this is developed, what is the etiology behind this? So here the etiology is nothing but, here some factors may cause the development of peptic ulcer, and some may have protective actions on the gastric mucosal lining. Okay, so any imbalance between these two factors may contribute for the development of peptic ulcer. Here, what are the protective factors here? So her protective factors includes mucus. Okay, so here HCl is secreted in the stomach, pepsin is secreted in the stomach. So for the digestion of meat, digestion of proteins, right? So this HCl, we know how corrosive the HCl is. It even digests our mucosal lining, but it can't. Why? This mucosal lining is further protected by the mucus layer. So here this mucus layer is composed of mucus and bicarbonates. So that's why, so these are considered as the protective factors. Okay, so here the protective factors includes mucus, bicarbonates, one more is prostaglandins. Okay, so here aggressive factors includes HCl, pepsin, and in other case here NSAIDs treatment, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs treatment, and infections with the H pylori. Okay, so these all are the reasons for the if any elevated levels of these aggressive factors or any uh, reduced concentration or under secretion of these protective factors leads to the development of peptic ulcer. So here, coming to the prostaglandins, so here these prostaglandins have protective action on the stomach. Here these prostaglandins will act on the EP3 receptors on the stomach. So they will decreases the HCl production within the stomach, and they will increases the mucus secretion. They will increases the bicarbonate secretion. They will strengthen the mucosal lining. They will increase the mucosal blood flow. So through all these mechanisms, it has a protective action on the stomach. Okay, if depleted levels of these prostaglandins also develop, leads to the development of peptic ulcer. Okay, so now we know causes for the peptic ulcer. Here, then we'll understand how the gastric acid is produced in the stomach. Okay, so here, where here in the stomach is composed of different layers. We all know, right? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and adventitia, and all those, right? So among these, the innermost layer, mucus layer, is composed of several cells. Okay, glandular epithelium is composed of several cells. So in that, we have mucous neck cells, and we have parietal cells, we have enterochromaffin cells, we have chief cells, we have D cells, and we have G cells, and all this. Okay, each has their own function. G cells releases the gastrin, which in turn releases the HCl, and D cells secretes somatostatin, which inhibits the gastrin. Chief cells will secrete pepsin, parietal cells secretes the HCl, mucus cells secretes mucus, and EC cells will secrete the histamine. Among these, the parietal cells of the stomach is responsible for the HCl production. How these parietal cells will secrete the HCl into the stomach? So here, so this parietal cell contains two membranes. Okay, one is the basolateral membrane, and another thing is the another side, lumen side. Okay, stomach side is the luminal membrane. Okay, so on the luminal side it contains a proton pump. So this proton pump is responsible for the secretion of H plus ions into the stomach. So this H plus ions then combined with the chlorides and forms the HCl. Okay, so here parietal cells secretes the HCl with the help of proton pump present on their luminal membrane site. Okay, but how this proton pump is activated? So which is activated due to various secretagogues. So what are the secretagogues? What are the mediators? So here one is histamine, and another one is the gastrin, and another one is the acetylcholine. Okay, so these three are stimulates the gastric acid production, and another thing is the prostaglandins. So here these prostaglandins will decreases the HCl production, other three will increases the HCl production. How these mediators will act? So these mediators, the released mediators, in that some are the autocoids, some are the hormones, some are the neurotransmitters. So these will act on the stomach, parietal cells of the stomach, and they stimulates the proton pump and causes the secretion of H plus ions. Here, through by acting on its receptors on the basolateral membrane. Okay, so what are the receptors for histamine? H2 receptors. Gastrin will act on the cholecystokinin receptors. Acetylcholine will act on the muscarinic receptor, N3 receptors. Okay, so this in turn will increases the activation of proton pump and causes the secretion of H plus ions. Okay, so how this will happen, I will discuss in detail. Okay, so here coming to the HCl production, which includes three phases, right? So one is the cephalic phase, and second one is the gastric phase, and third one is the intestinal phase. Okay, so here the cephalic phase begins when we see any food, or when we thought of food, or when we smell food, or when we see food. Okay, these when we taste food. Okay, all these will triggers the HCl production. How? Here all these triggers the vagus nerve to secrete HCl, to secrete acetylcholine. Okay, so these all these sight, smell of food, and all thought of food, all these will stimulate the vagus nerve. So the stimulated vagus nerve will release the acetylcholine. So where this acetylcholine acts? So this acetylcholine will acts on different cells of the stomach. Okay, and also on the ganglion cells. Okay, so this acetylcholine will act on the ganglion cells, M1 receptors on the ganglion cells, and secretes more acetylcholine. Okay, so then this acetylcholine will act on directly on the parietal cells, and will act indirectly by acting on gastrin and enterochromaffin cells. Okay, so this acetylcholine will act on three different types of cells. What are those? So one is on parietal cell, and another one is on G cells, and another one is the EC cells. Okay, so by acting on G cells, it will releases the gastrin. Okay, so then by acting on enterochromaffin cells, which secretes the histamine, and then third one is by acting on parietal cells, which secretes the HCl. Okay, so here in this way this acetylcholine will act on M3 receptors on the parietal cells and increases the HCl production. So then the presence of food during gastric phase, so which causes the distension of the stomach and which elevates the pH. All this will stimulates the G cells of the stomach. Okay, so these G cells are stimulated due to the presence of food. Okay, so what happened when these are stimulated? Which releases the gastrin into the stomach, into the bloodstream. This is the hormone which is released into the bloodstream. So this gastrin will act on two cells again. Okay, it will directly act on the parietal cells, CCK receptors and parietal cells, and it can also act on the again on the enterochromaffin cells. So here the acetylcholine also acts on the enterochromaffin cells, and the gastrin is also acts on the enterochromaffin cells. Okay, so what happened then? The gastrin acts on the enterochromaffin cells, so which secretes again the histamine. Okay, and here the gastrin by acting on CCK4 cells, CCK2 cells, which secretes the H plus. Okay, so due to acetylcholine and due to gastrin, so what is ultimately secreted? Histamine is secreted. So this histamine is also uh, increases the HCl production. How? So this histamine can act on the H2 receptors on the stomach. Okay, it will act on the H2 receptors on the stomach, and it will increases the cyclic AMP levels, and this in turn increase the protein kinase C, and which can activate the proton pump and causes the secretion of H plus ions. Okay, so in this way the HCl production is increased in the stomach. And we have another mediator. What is that? Prostaglandins. So what are prostaglandins actually? So the way they acts on the EP3 receptors on the stomach. So here coming to the remaining three, those three will increases the H plus in the stomach, but these prostaglandins will decreases the HCl. So by acting on EP3 receptors, they decrease the HCl production, and they increase the mucus concentration, and they increase the mucosal blood flow, and they increase the bicarbonate concentration, and they have cytoprotective actions. So in this way they will protect the gastric mucosa from ulceration, right? So here, so that here for the treatment of peptic ulcer, what is the primary approach? So being a aggressive factor, controlling of HCl is the primary factor, right? So how we can control the HCl? Either by blocking these M3 receptors for acetylcholine, receptors for gastrin, and receptors for the histamine, right? So among these, histamine is the major mediator. Why? Here the released acetylcholine will increases the histamine release, and the released gastrin will increases the histamine release. So histamine that is released from the enterochromaffin cell directly act on the parietal cells. Okay, so this acetylcholine and gastrin, they indirectly stimulate the acid production through the release of histamine. So that's why, so the histamine, when we control the histamine, the effect of gastrin and acetylcholine is also somewhat blocked. So that's why the histamine we considered as the major mediator. Okay, so that's why we can use H2 blockers for the controlling HCl production. We can block the H2 receptors. Okay, and we can also control the HCl production through by blocking last final step. Okay, all these triggers will finally activate the proton pump on the basolateral membrane. Okay, so if we control this proton pump, then also the HCl production is inhibited. Okay, so that's why we can give proton pump inhibitors. Okay, so apart from this, so we can also control the receptors for acetylcholine. We can also give anticholinergics, and we can also give prostaglandin analogs. Here prostaglandins are responsible for the decreased HCl production. So that's why we give analogs of prostaglandins to control the HCl production. Okay, so in this way, that we can use, these are the drugs that can act by decreasing the HCl production. So here one of the primary approach for treating peptic ulcer is controlling of HCl production within the stomach. How can we achieve this? By blocking all these receptors and by giving the prostaglandin analogs. So not only this approach, here we can also control the HCl. Uh, we can control the peptic ulcers by neutralizing the HCl present already within the stomach. So for this purpose, we can give gastric acid neutralizers are nothing but antacids. Okay, the second approach is by neutralizing the gastric acid. Okay, that is nothing but antacid treatment. And the third approach is, so we can also protect the ulcerative ulcered gastric mucosa by the protectors. Okay, some drugs will form a protective layer over this gastric ulcer, peptic ulcer. So that's why here we can also give that protective agents. Okay, apart from this, so H pylori infection is also one of the causative organisms for the peptic ulcer. So that's why we can also give anti-H pylori drugs, nothing but antibiotics. Okay, so these are the different approaches for peptic ulcer treatment. Okay, so let's see the drugs used for the peptic ulcer. So here, what are first category of drugs? H2 blockers, and the second category are proton pump blockers. Third are anticholinergics, and fourth are prostaglandin analogs. Here others, the first one are acts through the reduction of gastric acid secretion, and the second one are acts by neutralizing the gastric acid, nothing but antacids. So these antacids are of two types again. Okay, some may absorb into the bloodstream, some may not. Okay, so that's why they are classified into two types, systemic and non-systemic. Okay, and then ulcer protectives, how they act? They act by forming a protective layer over ulcer base. Okay, So then the final category of drugs are antibiotics. They may control the H. pylori infections. So these are the drugs used for the treatment of peptic ulcer.